Hello there, my Twilight souls. Tonight, we journey with Charlie Swan, the quiet father who loved from a distance, the steady man who stayed when others left, who chose duty over expression and silence over explanation. He is the father who sacrificed twice, who let love go because staying seemed selfish, who carried grief in silence because that was all he knew how to do. So, before you get cozy, I want to tell you something small and honest. I have this dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers before the month ends. If you've been enjoying these stories and you'd like to help me get there, subscribing would mean so much. Now, let's ease into a peaceful moment together and let Charlie's quiet strength carry you softly into rest. Charles Michael Swan was born in Forks, Washington, on an unremarkable Tuesday in April of 1952. The only child of Jeffrey and Helen Swan, who had themselves been born in this rain-soaked corner of the Olympic Peninsula, and who had never seriously considered living anywhere else, despite the isolation and the endless precipitation and the economic uncertainty that characterized life in a logging town, where prosperity rose and fell with timber prices and environmental regulations that seemed to shift with every election cycle. The Forks of Charlie's childhood was even smaller than the town Bella would eventually know. Barely 2,000 people clustered around the intersection of Highway 101 and the logging roads that snaked into the dense forest, covering every hillside and valley. The community existing primarily to support the timber industry that employed most of the adult men, and that defined the rhythm of life through boom and bust cycles that everyone learned to navigate with stoic resignation. The Swan family lived in a small house on the edge of town, where the forest pressed close enough that deer wandered through their backyard with alarming regularity, and the sound of rain on the roof was so constant it became white noise that Charlie would miss acutely during the brief dry spells that came in late summer. Jeffrey Swan worked at the lumber mill, doing maintenance on the massive saws and conveyor systems that processed old-growth timber into boards and planks, destined for construction sites across the Pacific Northwest and beyond. His skilled hands and mechanical aptitude keeping the equipment running when breakdowns threatened to halt production and cost the company thousands of dollars per hour. Helen worked part-time at the local grocery store, her income supplementing Jeffrey's wages enough that the family could afford small luxuries like the black and white television that arrived when Charlie was 7, and that became the center of their evening routine. The three of them gathered in the living room, watching whatever programs the Seattle stations broadcast clearly enough through the mountains and the rain. Charlie's childhood unfolded with the particular rhythms of small-town 1950s and 60s America, filtered through the specific realities of Pacific Northwest logging culture. His days organized around school and chores, and the long, unsupervised hours that children of that era spent exploring the forests and streams that surrounded Forks on all sides. He learned to fish before he was 6 years old, his father taking him to the Sole Duke River and the Bogachil, and teaching him to read the water for the deep pools where steelhead and salmon held during their spawning runs. The patience required for successful fishing suiting Charlie's naturally quiet temperament in ways that more active sports never would. He spent entire summer days standing in cold water wearing rubber boots too large for his feet. His cheap fiberglass rod extended over currents he was learning to understand through observation and repetition, and his father's occasional terse instructions about where to cast and how long to let the line drift before reeling in and trying again. School was something Charlie attended without particular enthusiasm or resistance. His grades consistently average across all subjects, his teachers noting that he was well behaved and respectful, but rarely participated in class discussions unless directly called upon, and seemed content to fade into the background, while more outgoing students claimed the teacher's attention and the social spotlight. He played basketball and baseball with adequate skill, but no exceptional talent, his coaches appreciating his reliability and his willingness to accept whatever position needed filling rather than demanding to play the prestigious roles that other boys fought over. He had friends in the casual way that boys in small towns had friends, relationships built on proximity and shared activities rather than deep emotional connection or extensive conversation, groups that gathered to fish or explore the woods, or later to work on cars in someone's driveway, their companionship requiring minimal verbal exchange and maximum comfortable silence. The town of Forks in those decades was insular and self-contained in ways that would become increasingly rare as the 20th century progressed. Nearly everyone knowing everyone else's business through overlapping family connections and the casual gossip that spread through the grocery store and the diner and the churches where most families spent Sunday mornings. The logging industry dominated everything. The mill whistle marking shift changes that organized the town's daily rhythm as surely as church bells had organized medieval villages, the boom times bringing new trucks and home improvements, while the bus periods meant layoffs and worry and quiet conversations about whether this downturn would be the one that finally killed the town entirely. Charlie absorbed the particular Pacific Northwest working-class masculinity that characterized his father's generation, and that he would carry unchanged into his own adulthood. The stoicism that treated emotional expression as weakness and physical endurance as virtue. The comfort with silence and discomfort with introspection. The belief that love manifested through actions and provision rather than words or demonstrations. His friendship with Billy Black began in elementary school and deepened through their teenage years. The Quileute boy from the reservation at La Push, becoming Charlie's closest friend, despite, or perhaps because of their similarly taciturn natures and their shared love of fishing and their mutual understanding that friendship did not require constant conversation or social performance. They spent countless hours together on the beaches at La Push and in the rivers that ran through the reservation land, their friendship bridging the subtle divide between the town of Forks and the Quileute community in ways that were unusual enough to be noteworthy, but not so unusual as to cause comment or concern. Billy's family welcomed Charlie into their home with the casual hospitality that characterized reservation culture. feeding him meals and including him in activities without making his presence feel like imposition or charity. Their acceptance providing Charlie with second family and with connection to community and traditions older and richer than anything Forks proper could offer. The decision to stay in Forks after graduating high school in 1970 was not really a decision, so much as an absence of any compelling reason to leave. Charlie's adequate but unexceptional grades not opening doors to prestigious universities, and his lack of wanderlust making the idea of moving to Seattle or Portland or anywhere else seem unnecessary and vaguely threatening. Many of his classmates left for college or military service, or simply for the promise of better opportunities in larger cities where the economy did not depend entirely on timber and where the rain fell somewhat less relentlessly than it did on the Olympic Peninsula. But Charlie felt no pull toward those distant possibilities, his attachment to Forks running deeper than conscious choice or rational calculation. The forests and the rivers and the familiar rhythms of small town life feeling like home in ways he could not articulate, but that made the thought of leaving seem like abandonment of something essential to his identity. The path to law enforcement emerged gradually, rather than arriving as sudden revelation or calling. Charlie's natural sense of fairness and his respect for order combining with the practical reality that Forks needed police officers, and that the work offered stable employment with decent benefits and the opportunity to serve his community in visible and valued ways. He attended the police academy in Seattle for 6 months of training that represented his longest sustained absence from Forks since birth. The experience confirming rather than challenging his desire to return home and build his life in the place he had always known. The academy taught him procedure and law, and the practical skills of investigation and arrest and report writing. But more importantly, it gave him structure and authority and sense of purpose that suited his temperament perfectly. The clear rules and expectations of police work providing framework within which his natural quietness and his observational skills became assets rather than social liabilities. He joined the Forks Police Department in 1971 at age 19, one of only 6 officers serving a jurisdiction that covered the town itself, and significant surrounding territory where the county sheriff's department handled most calls, but where Forks PD sometimes assisted or took lead, depending on the nature of the incident and the availability of personnel. The work in those early years was mostly mundane, responding to traffic accidents and domestic disputes and occasional bar fights, writing tickets for speeding and parking violations, checking on elderly residents during bad weather, managing the minimal crime that occurred in a community where everyone knew everyone and where serious criminal activity was rare enough to be shocking when it occurred. Charlie learned the roads and the people and the patterns of his jurisdiction with the same patient attention he had once applied to learning the rivers and the fish, his knowledge accumulating gradually until he could navigate every logging road in darkness and could identify most residents by sight and could sense when something was wrong in his town through subtle changes in atmosphere or behavior that less observant officers might miss entirely. His reputation built slowly but solidly through his 20s, the community coming to know Charlie Swan as fair and reliable and thoroughly decent, someone who would help change a tire or deliver bad news with appropriate gravity, or look the other way when teenagers were drinking beer at the beach, as long as they were not driving or causing trouble. He was not particularly ambitious in ways that involved seeking promotion or recognition, his satisfaction coming from doing the work well rather than from advancement or accolades. But his competence and his dedication were obvious to everyone who worked with him or encountered him in official capacity. He bought a small house on the edge of town in 1975, a 2-bedroom structure that needed work, but that was within his budget and that represented the kind of permanent roots that many of his generation were establishing as they moved from youth into early adulthood. The bachelor years that followed were comfortable and routine, in ways Charlie found deeply satisfying. His days organized around work shifts and fishing trips and the sports he watched on the television that now broadcast in color and offered far more channels than the limited selection of his childhood. He cooked simple meals for himself, his repertoire limited to the basics his mother had taught him, and the even simpler preparations that required minimal skill or attention. He maintained his house and his truck with the same patient competence he brought to all practical tasks, his mechanical aptitude inherited from his father serving him well as he learned to handle repairs and improvements that saved money and gave him satisfaction of solving problems with his own hands and tools. He dated occasionally and casually, relationships that never progressed beyond a few dinners or movies before fading away through mutual lack of interest, rather than through any dramatic ending or incompatibility. He might have continued in this pattern indefinitely, his life unfolding along predictable and fundamentally satisfying trajectories, his future involving gradual advancement through the police department ranks and eventual retirement to spend his days fishing and watching sports. If Renee Higginbotham had not arrived in Forks in the summer of 1984 and changed everything with her presence and her laughter and her fundamental difference from everything Charlie had ever known or imagined wanting. Renee Higginbotham arrived in Forks on a summer road trip through the Olympic Peninsula with 2 friends from her college art program. The 3 young women in their early 20s driving a battered Volkswagen van painted with flowers and peace signs that marked them as the kind of free-spirited creative types who rarely ventured into logging towns where tie-dye and long skirts drew stares from locals accustomed to more conservative fashion and more conventional life choices. They stopped at the diner on the highway for lunch and directions to the beaches at La Push. Renee's voice carrying across the small restaurant with laughter that sounded like music to Charlie, who was sitting at the counter finishing his own meal during a break from patrol. He watched her in the mirror behind the counter. This woman with wild curly hair and bright clothing and animated gestures, who seemed to contain more energy and life than the entire town of Forks combined, her presence making the familiar diner feel suddenly small and drab and desperately in need of the color and vitality she radiated simply by existing in the space. She caught him watching and smiled with a kind of open warmth that Charlie associated with people who had never learned to be guarded or cautious. Her lack of self-consciousness so complete that his staring seemed to please rather than disturb her. She approached his stool with confidence that suggested she had never met a stranger or encountered a social situation that made her uncomfortable, asking whether he knew the best route to the ocean and whether the beaches were worth visiting, or whether they should continue south toward the Oregon coast instead. Charlie found himself answering with more words than he typically used in entire conversations. His usual reticence overwhelmed by desire to keep her talking and standing close enough that he could smell whatever floral perfume or shampoo she used and could see the exact shade of brown in her eyes that seemed to shift between amber and chocolate depending on how the light struck them. He offered to show them the way to La Push, using his authority as police officer to justify leaving his patrol route to guide 3 tourists to the reservation beaches. His professional responsibility to ensure visitors could navigate the confusing network of roads providing convenient excuse for the personal interest that was obvious to everyone in the diner who watched him follow the hippie van in his police cruiser, with an expression they had never seen on his usually stoic face. The drive to La Push took 30 minutes along winding roads through dense forest, Charlie checking his rearview mirror constantly to ensure the van was still following, his heart racing with anxiety that they might turn around or get lost, or simply disappear back into whatever world had produced someone as bright and alive as Renee. At the beach, he found himself walking beside her along the grey sand while her friends explored tide pools and took photographs, their conversation ranging across topics Charlie had never discussed with anyone. Renee asking about his life and his work and his dreams with genuine interest that seemed impossible, given they had met less than 2 hours earlier. She told him about her art and her travels and her philosophy, that life was meant to be experienced fully and spontaneously rather than planned and controlled. Her worldview so completely opposite to everything Charlie believed and practiced that he should have recognized the fundamental incompatibility immediately, but instead found himself enchanted by the difference, drawn to her spontaneity and her passion, like someone who had lived in darkness being offered sunlight for the first time. She stayed in Forks for 3 days that stretched into a week, and then 2 weeks, as her friends eventually left without her, and she moved into the motel on the highway and found reasons to delay her departure that had everything to do with the quiet police officer who appeared at the motel every evening after his shift ended to take her to dinner or for walks along the river. Charlie fell in love with certainty and completeness that terrified and exhilarated him simultaneously, his 32 years of careful emotional control dissolving under the force of feelings he had not known he was capable of experiencing. He loved her laughter and her impulsiveness, and the way she made everything feel possible and exciting. Loved how she filled his silences with observations and stories and questions that made him think about his life and his choices in ways he had carefully avoided for decades. She was everything he was not. Every quality and characteristic he lacked made manifest in this woman who seemed to float through life guided by intuition and desire rather than duty and routine. The courtship was brief and intense, measured in weeks rather than months or years. Renee's presence in Forks becoming permanent when she moved into Charlie's small house in September of 1984, with only the possessions she had brought in her backpack and the art supplies she bought at the craft store in Port Angeles. They married at the courthouse in October with Billy Black and one of Renee's friends as witnesses, the ceremony taking less than 15 minutes and costing $37 for the license and the judge's fee, the simplicity suiting Charlie perfectly, while Renee seemed unbothered by the lack of ceremony or celebration, her ability to find joy in any circumstance, making even the sterile courthouse feel romantic and meaningful. the early months of marriage existed in a honeymoon haze where their differences seemed charming rather than problematic. Renee's chaos balanced by Charlie's order, his silence filled by her constant conversation, her artistic temperament complemented by his practical stability. She painted in the second bedroom that Charlie had been using for storage, her canvases covering the walls and her supplies spreading across every surface, the smell of oil paint and turpentine replacing the musty odor of boxes and old fishing equipment. She cooked elaborate meals that sometimes succeeded and sometimes failed spectacularly, her lack of interest in following recipes or measuring ingredients creating dinners that range from surprisingly delicious to completely inedible. Charlie learning to keep cereal and sandwich supplies readily available for the evenings when her culinary experiments proved impossible to consume. But the cracks appeared before their first anniversary. Renee's initial enchantment with small-town life fading as the reality of Forks in winter settled over her like the constant rain that fell from October through May. She missed her friends and her art community and the cultural opportunities of the city, missed concerts and galleries, and the simple possibility of encountering strangers and new experiences rather than seeing the same familiar faces day after day in a town where nothing ever changed and nothing ever happened. She started projects with enormous enthusiasm and abandoned them halfway through when something new caught her attention. The house filling with half-finished paintings and partially completed craft projects and art supplies for hobbies she had already moved beyond. She took a job at the local library that lasted 6 weeks before she quit because her supervisor was too controlling and did not appreciate her creative approach to cataloging, then worked briefly at a gift shop that closed when tourism declined in the off-season, then tried selling her artwork at the weekend market in Port Angeles with minimal success. Charlie tried to make her happy through the only methods he knew, working extra shifts to earn money for trips to Seattle or supplies for her latest enthusiasm, buying her gifts he thought she might like, suggesting activities they could do together that might alleviate her boredom and restlessness. But he couldn't give her what she really needed, which was stimulation and change and the kind of vibrant social and cultural life that simply did not exist in Forks and could not be created through any amount of effort or good intentions. He could not make himself more talkative or more emotionally expressive, could not transform his fundamental nature to match what she needed from a partner, could not fill the silences that she increasingly experienced as absence rather than comfortable companionship. They began to argue about things that mattered and things that did not, her frustration with his quietness and his routines erupting into criticism and complaints, his confusion about what she wanted from him making him defensive and withdrawn. The pregnancy announcement in early 1987 came as shock to them both, despite having taken no particular precautions against conception. Renee's reaction mixing joy with obvious panic, her understanding that a baby would make leaving Forks even more complicated, warring with genuine excitement about motherhood and the creative possibilities of raising a child. Charlie's response was uncomplicated happiness and relief. His certainty that a baby would give Renee purpose and connection to Forks and would create the family he had always wanted without quite knowing how to ask for or build. He threw himself into preparation with the same thorough competence he brought to all practical tasks, converting the art room back into a bedroom, painting the walls yellow because they did not know the baby's sex, buying a crib and changing table and drawers full of tiny clothes, reading books about infant care and childhood development with the determined focus of someone studying for an important examination. Bella's birth on September 13th, 1987 at Forks Community Hospital was the best moment of Charlie's life up to that point and possibly ever after. His daughter placed in his arms for the first time, creating feelings of love and terror, an overwhelming responsibility that made his feelings for Renee seem almost simple by comparison. She was tiny and red-faced and absolutely perfect, her small fingers wrapping around his thumb with grip that felt surprisingly strong, her eyes opening briefly to reveal dark blue that would eventually change to brown like her mother's. He held her and made silent promises about the life he would give her, the fishing trips they would take, and the forests he would show her, and the absolute safety and love she would always have from her father, who would protect her from everything harmful or dangerous in the world. But Renee's postpartum experience was difficult in ways that went beyond normal adjustment to new motherhood. Her artistic temperament and her need for freedom and spontaneity completely incompatible with the relentless demands of caring for an infant who needed constant attention and feeding and diaper changes according to schedules that could not be ignored or postponed when inspiration struck or boredom set in. She loved Bella desperately and completely, her devotion to their daughter never in question. But the practical realities of motherhood in isolated Forks, with a partner who worked long shifts and who did not know how to provide emotional support or help with the invisible labor of managing a household and a baby, overwhelmed her completely. The small house felt like a prison. The rain that fell constantly through that autumn and winter seemed to trap them inside with crying baby and unwashed dishes and the endless cycle of feeding and changing and soothing that consumed every hour of every day. The arguments intensified through the winter as Renee's unhappiness became impossible to hide or ignore. Her resentment toward Forks and toward the life she had chosen spilling out in accusations that Charlie could not answer because they were fundamentally true. That he had known she was unhappy, but had hoped a baby would fix everything. That he had wanted her to change herself to fit his life rather than being willing to change anything about himself or his choices to accommodate her needs. They fought about his silence and her chaos, about his contentment with Forks and her desperate need to escape, about his emotional unavailability and her unrealistic expectations, about everything and nothing until the fighting itself became just another source of exhaustion and pain that neither of them had energy to address or resolve. The conversation about divorce happened on a rainy March evening in 1988, when Bella was 6 months old and sleeping in her crib while her parents sat at the kitchen table and acknowledged what both had known for months, but had been afraid to say aloud. Renee told Charlie she was leaving, that she was taking Bella to Phoenix, where her mother lived and where she could get help with childcare, and where the sun shone and the world felt open rather than claustrophobic and suffocating. Charlie understood that fighting would be pointless and cruel, that Renee was drowning in Fork, and that he could not save her because he was part of what was pulling her under. He asked about custody with dread heavy in his chest, knowing already what the answer would be, but needing to hear it spoken clearly so there would be no confusion or false hope. She wanted full custody, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Bella needed her mother, and needed stability, and needed to be somewhere Renee could actually function as a parent, rather than barely surviving each day. Charlie could visit, she promised, could have Bella for summers or holidays, could be part of his daughter's life even though he would not be part of her daily existence. He agreed, because what else could he do? Because fighting for custody would mean proving Renee unfit, and he would never hurt her that way, even though she was hurting him more deeply than he had known it was possible to be hurt. Because a baby needed her mother more than she needed a father who worked all day and who did not know how to talk about feelings or provide the kind of nurturing care that infants required. They filed the papers in April, and the divorce was final by June. The legal ending of their marriage taking less time than their courtship had consumed. The judge awarding Renee full physical custody with Charlie, granted visitation rights that seemed generous on paper, but that amounted to 2 weeks every summer and alternating holidays that would require expensive plane tickets and complicated logistics. Charlie helped Renee pack her belongings and Bella's supplies into boxes that filled her car completely. His daughter sleeping in her car seat, unaware that she was leaving the only home she had ever known, and the father who loved her more than his own life. The goodbye in the driveway was brief and awkward. Renee crying and apologizing and promising to send pictures and to call regularly. Charlie standing silent because words were impossible and because anything he might say would only make the leaving harder for both of them. He watched them drive away until the car disappeared around the corner, then went inside to the too quiet house where Bella's room stood empty and waiting, her crib still assembled and her clothes still folded in the drawers, because taking it all apart would make the loss too real and too permanent to bear. The first summer visit happened in June of 1989, when Bella was not quite 2 years old, too young to remember the flight from Phoenix, or the father who met her and Renee at the Seattle airport with hands that shook slightly as he reached for his daughter and lifted her into arms that had ached with emptiness for the entire year since she had left. She looked at him with solemn brown eyes that were Renee's eyes, in a face that was becoming her own, rather than simply a baby face. Her expression serious and considering as she studied the stranger who held her with such careful reverence and who could not stop staring at her like she was miraculous, rather than simply a toddler in overalls with jam still sticky on her fingers from breakfast on the plane. The 2 weeks stretched ahead full of promise and terror. Charlie, having prepared obsessively for this visit, in ways that probably crossed into absurdity, but that felt necessary given how little time he would have with his daughter, and how desperately he wanted everything to be perfect. He had bought new sheets for her crib, and toys he hoped were age-appropriate, and foods that Renee had mentioned Bella liked in their brief phone conversations. His house scrubbed cleaner than it had been since before the divorce. Every surface wiped, and every floor vacuumed in preparation for the tiny person who would judge him without knowing she was judging, and who held his entire heart in her small hands, whether she understood that power or not. Renee stayed for the first 3 days to help with the transition, her presence making things easier and harder simultaneously, the familiar awkwardness between them, now compounded by the weight of everything lost and everything that could never be recovered or repaired. She showed him Bella's routines and preferences, the specific way she liked her bottle warmed, and the songs that helped her fall asleep, and the signs that meant she needed a diaper change, or was getting tired, or was about to have a tantrum. Charlie took notes mentally and wished he could take them physically. His fear of forgetting some crucial detail and failing his daughter, making him hyper-attentive to every piece of information Renee provided. About caring for the small person who was technically his child, but who felt more like a fragile treasure on loan that he might break or lose through simple incompetence. When Renee left for her own visit with friends in Seattle, Charlie found himself alone with Bella for the first time in over a year. Just the two of them in the small house that felt simultaneously too big and too small for the magnitude of what was happening. The days developed their own rhythm, born of necessity and trial and error. Charlie learning through mistakes and successes what worked and what did not, when caring for a toddler whose needs he was still learning to read and anticipate. He took her fishing, even though she was too young to hold a rod or understand the patience required, simply holding her on his hip while he cast one-handed into the Soul Duke River, her presence making the familiar activity feel new and significant and worth doing, even if he caught nothing. He drove her to La Push, where Billy's daughters, who were barely older than Bella themselves, played with her in the sand, while Charlie and Billy sat in lawn chairs and talked about nothing important. The companionable silence of their friendship, now punctuated by Bella's occasional shrieks of delight or frustration. The nights were hardest. Bella crying for her mother in the darkness of the unfamiliar room. Charlie walking the floors with her and singing off-key lullabies he half remembered from his own childhood, and feeling helpless and inadequate in ways that his police training and his practical competence could not address or solve. He learned that she would eventually fall asleep on his chest if he sat in the rocking chair and kept moving, her small body relaxing into trust despite her initial distress, her breathing evening out into the deep rhythm of infant sleep that made his own exhaustion feel worthwhile and meaningful. He would sit holding her long after she slept, afraid to move and wake her, his arms going numb and his back aching, but his heart so full he thought it might burst with the impossible love he felt for this person he barely knew, but who owned him completely. The 2 weeks passed with devastating speed, each day bringing them closer to the goodbye that Charlie dreaded with increasing intensity, as Bella became more comfortable with him and started to smile when she saw him and to reach for him when she wanted to be held. He took hundreds of photographs with the camera he bought, specifically for documenting these visits, trying to capture every expression and every moment so he would have something to look at during the 11 months before he would see her again. The goodbye at the airport was agony, Bella crying and reaching for him as Renee carried her toward security, his daughter's distress making him want to chase after them and demand more time and rail against the unfairness of loving someone he was not allowed to keep. The pattern repeated every June for the next 5 years. 2 weeks carved out of Bella's childhood and Charlie's existence when they could be together and attempt to build relationship across the impossible distance that geography and divorce had created between them. The visit changed as Bella grew from toddler to child, her personality emerging more clearly with each passing summer. Charlie observing that she was quiet like him and serious beyond her years. that she seemed to carry responsibilities that no child should bear, but that she accepted without complaint or apparent awareness that her experience was unusual or difficult. She talked about taking care of Renee in ways that made Charlie's chest tighten with concern and guilt. Stories about reminding her mother to pay bills, or making sure there was food in the house, or cleaning up when Renee's latest artistic project created chaos that no one else seemed capable of managing. He wanted to intervene somehow, to call Renee and demand that she be more responsible, or to file for custody modification based on what seemed like clear evidence that Bella was being parentified in ways that would damage her development and her childhood. But he did not know how to have those conversations without destroying the fragile cooperation that allowed him to see Bella at all. His fear that Renee would cut off his access entirely if he criticized her parenting, making him swallow his concerns and simply try to give Bella the most stable and carefree 2 weeks possible when she was with him. He established routines that Bella seemed to crave, regular meal times and consistent bedtimes and activities. They did every visit because the predictability seemed to provide relief from whatever chaos characterized her life in Phoenix. They went to the same diner for breakfast every Saturday morning. Bella ordering chocolate chip pancakes and orange juice and sitting across from Charlie in the booth, talking about school or books or whatever was on her mind. Her willingness to fill the silences, something he appreciated, even as he wished he was better at asking questions or initiating conversations that would help him know her more deeply. They visited La Push every visit, where Bella played with Jacob Black, who was younger, but who followed her around with obvious admiration. The two children building elaborate structures from driftwood and searching for sea glass and crabs in the tide pools while Charlie and Billy fished nearby. The easy companionship of those beach days became something Charlie looked forward to all year. The sight of Bella happy and playing like a normal child, rather than the small adult she seemed to be in Phoenix, making him believe that maybe these brief visits were providing something valuable, even if they could never be enough. As Bella got older, the visits became more complex, her questions more difficult to answer, her observations about the differences between her life in Forks and her life in Phoenix, revealing intelligence and awareness that made Charlie proud and sad simultaneously. She asked why he and Renee got divorced, and he tried to explain in age-appropriate terms that sometimes people loved each other but could not live together happily, that the divorce was about adult problems and had nothing to do with Bella or anything she had done. She asked why she could not live with him in Forks, and he explained about custody and about how children needed to be in school year-round, and about how her mother would miss her too much if she moved away. His explanations feeling inadequate and dishonest even as he spoke them, because the real truth was that he had agreed to give her up and now lived with the consequences of that choice every single day. The phone calls between visits were stilted and brief, Charlie's difficulty with verbal communication making the conversations awkward. His questions about school and friends receiving monosyllabic answers that told him nothing substantial about Bella's life or well-being. Her obvious discomfort with phone conversations matching his own and creating exchanges that satisfied neither of them, but that represented their only contact during the long stretches between summer visits. He sent birthday gifts and Christmas presents chosen with agonizing care from catalogs and websites. trying to select things she would actually like rather than things he thought she should like. His success rate mixed at best based on the thank you notes Renee made Bella write and mail with mechanical politeness that suggested obligation rather than genuine appreciation. Charlie marked time between visits in ways that probably qualified as unhealthy obsession, crossing days off the calendar and planning activities months in advance and buying things throughout the year that he thought Bella might enjoy during her next stay. His house remained arranged around her visits, her room kept ready and updated as she grew, the toys and books rotating to match her changing age and interest, based on whatever intelligence he could gather from Renee or from Bella's brief comments during their phone calls. His co-workers knew not to expect much from him in the weeks leading up to Bella's visits, his distraction and his excitement making him useless for anything requiring sustained concentration or attention to detail beyond the bare minimum his job required. The shift happened when Bella turned 14 in 2001. Her phone call in May of that year announcing that she would not be coming to Forks that summer, delivering news that Charlie had half expected, but that still felt like physical blow when actually spoken aloud. She had summer school, she said, her voice carrying the particular tone of teenagers who are lying to their parents, and friends she did not want to leave, and a job she had just started. The excuses were transparent, and Charlie knew better than to challenge them directly. His understanding that forcing a teenage girl to spend time with him would only breed resentment, making him accept her decision with outward grace that masked the devastation he felt at losing even this minimal connection to his daughter. He told her he understood, and that maybe she could come for a week later in the summer, or maybe they could figure out a visit during her spring break next year. His suggestions met with vague agreement that they both knew would never materialize into actual plans. When he hung up the phone, he sat in his kitchen staring at nothing, the realization settling over him that he had lost her in ways that went beyond the physical distance of the divorce, that whatever relationship they had built during those summer visits had not been strong enough or meaningful enough to survive her adolescence and her growing awareness of how strange and uncomfortable their forced time together actually was. Billy commented on Bella's absence when he called to invite Charlie fishing that June. His friend's careful questions about whether everything was okay between Charlie and his daughter, revealing that the situation was obvious to outside observers, even if Charlie wanted to pretend otherwise. He explained about summer school and jobs with the same false casualness that Bella had used, both of them aware they were maintaining polite fiction rather than addressing the painful reality that his daughter was choosing to avoid him, and that he had no power to change that choice or to repair whatever had broken between them. The following summers passed without Bella's presence, her room in his house becoming shrine to a relationship that existed mostly in his memory and his hope rather than in present reality, her childhood possessions gathering dust, while he left everything exactly as it had been during her last visit, as if maintaining the space would somehow bring her back. He sent birthday cards that she acknowledged with brief thank you texts once she had a cell phone, his attempts to initiate calls going mostly unanswered, their relationship reduced to the bare minimum of contact that allowed them both to pretend they still knew each other while avoiding the painful truth that they had become strangers, connected only by biology and history, and his persistent, unrequited love. The phone call came on a Tuesday evening in early January of 2005, while Charlie was eating dinner in front of the television. His usual routine of microwaved meal and whatever sports game was broadcasting, interrupted by his cell phone ringing with Renee's number displayed on the screen. Her calls rare enough that seeing her name always triggered immediate worry that something terrible had happened to Bella, or that some emergency required his attention or intervention. He answered with his heart already racing, his greeting coming out more tense than he intended, his relief when he heard Bella's voice instead of Renee's immediate and overwhelming, even before he knew the reason for the unexpected call. She told him she wanted to move to Forks, the words delivered with the particular false casualness teenagers used when making requests they expected to be denied or questioned. Her explanation about wanting to give Renee and Phil space, and about thinking it would be good to spend time with Charlie before college coming too quickly, and sounding too rehearsed to be entirely truthful. Charlie listened without interrupting, his years of police work making him skilled at reading subtext and recognizing when people were not telling him the complete story. His certainty that Bella's sudden desire to move had more to do with Renee's needs than with Bella's actual preference for Forks, warring with his overwhelming joy at the prospect of having his daughter living with him after so many years of minimal contact and forced distance. He agreed immediately before she could change her mind, or before his brain could catch up with his heart and point out all the ways this arrangement might fail or disappoint them both. His simple statement that she was welcome anytime, and that he would be happy to have her, seeming to surprise Bella, based on the slight pause before she responded with relief evident in her voice. They discussed logistics with the awkward efficiency of people who barely knew each other trying to plan cohabitation. Bella's questions about school enrollment and whether she would need her own car receiving answers that Charlie tried to make sound casual rather than desperately eager. His fear that showing too much enthusiasm might make her reconsider making him carefully moderate his tone and his responses to seem welcoming, but not overwhelming. When he hung up the phone, he sat in stunned silence for several minutes, the reality of what had just happened settling over him with a weight that mixed joy and terror in equal measures. His certainty that he would fail somehow at this second chance to be Bella's father, warring with his determination to do everything possible to make her comfortable and happy in Forks. He called Billy immediately to share the news and to ask whether the old Chevy truck Billy had mentioned selling might still be available. His plan forming even as he spoke about wanting to give Bella independence and transportation that would make living in Forks more bearable for a 17-year-old girl accustomed to Phoenix's sprawl and sunshine. The weeks before Bella's arrival passed in a flurry of preparation that probably crossed into obsessive territory. Charlie taking vacation days to clean the house more thoroughly than he had cleaned it in years, repainting Bella's room in colors he hoped a teenage girl would find acceptable, buying new bedding and curtains and a desk where she could do homework. He consulted female co-workers about what teenagers needed or wanted, their suggestions ranging from practical items like good reading lamps and full-length mirrors to less tangible advice about giving her space and not asking too many questions, and remembering that 17-year-old girls needed privacy and autonomy more than they needed hovering parents trying to make up for lost time. He drove to Le Push to finalize the truck purchase with Billy, the 1953 Chevy pickup, sitting in Billy's garage where it had been stored for years, its faded red paint and manual transmission and complete lack of modern safety features making it exactly the kind of vehicle that would probably horrify Renee, but that Charlie thought Bella might appreciate for its character and reliability. Jacob had already done significant work on the engine at Billy's request, the 16-year-old's mechanical skills ensuring the truck would run safely despite its age, his obvious excitement about seeing Bella again, making Charlie remember the childhood summers when Jacob and Bella had played together on the beach and had been easy friends in ways that seemed impossible to recreate. Now that they were both teenagers with years of separation between them. The day of Bella's arrival, Charlie left work early to drive to Seattle for her flight, his nervousness increasing with each mile, his certainty that he would say something wrong or do something awkward, making the drive feel interminable, despite having made the trip hundreds of times over the years for various reasons. He waited at baggage claim, watching passengers stream past, while searching for the daughter he had not seen in person for nearly 4 years. His mental image of 14-year-old Bella, inadequate preparation for the nearly adult young woman, who appeared looking tired and uncertain, and so much like Renee at that age that his breath caught painfully in his chest. The drive back to Forks was marked by Charlie's unusual talkativeness, his nervousness manifesting as information dump about the town and the school and the house and the truck, his compulsive need to fill the silence probably overwhelming but impossible to control given the magnitude of what was happening, and his desperate desire to make Bella feel welcome and wanted despite the awkwardness that vibrated between them like physical presence. She responded with monosyllables mostly, her exhaustion from travel and from whatever emotional turmoil had prompted this move making her even quieter than usual, her gaze fixed on the landscape transforming from urban sprawl to rural wilderness as they drove deeper into the Olympic Peninsula, where rain had begun falling somewhere around Port Angeles and showed no signs of stopping. The house looked small and shabby when they pulled into the driveway, Charlie seeing it through Bella's eyes and finding it wanting despite his preparation and his cleaning, his awareness that she was leaving Phoenix sunshine and whatever life she had built there to live in this cramped space with a father who barely knew her, making him want to apologize for the inadequacy of what he was offering. But she smiled when she saw her room, her reaction to the purple bedding and the rocking chair, and the desk seeming genuinely pleased rather than simply polite, her hug catching him off guard with its spontaneity and its duration. The physical affection, something they had not shared since she was small enough to be carried and young enough to not find her father's presence awkward or uncomfortable. The truck revelation happened in the driveway, Charlie leading her outside with anxiety twisting his stomach, because maybe she would hate it, or think it was too old, or be offended that he had not bought her something newer and safer and more appropriate for a teenage girl. But her face, when she saw it, transformed into the first genuine smile he had seen since the airport, her obvious delight making his throat tight with emotion he could not express verbally, her immediate request for the keys and her excited exploration of the cab and the engine, making him understand that he had somehow managed to give her exactly the right thing despite all his worry about failing or disappointing her. The first days of cohabitation were exercises in careful navigation and boundary establishment. Both of them learning to share space and accommodate each other's routines and habits. Charlie trying to give Bella the independence she clearly needed, while also wanting to be present and available in ways he had never been able to be during her childhood. He cooked his limited repertoire of meals and was surprised when she took over kitchen duties without being asked. Her competence and her ease with domestic tasks, revealing the truth of what he had suspected during summer visits about her role in Renee's household and the responsibilities she had been carrying that no teenager should have to manage. He wanted to tell her she did not need to take care of him, that he was the parent and she was the child, and the roles should not be reversed. But he sensed that she needed this control and this contribution to feel secure in his house, that cooking and cleaning gave her purpose and structure in the chaos of having uprooted her entire life. School started, and Bella integrated into Forks High School with what appeared to be surprising ease, based on the reports Charlie heard through the small-town gossip network that informed him of everything happening in his jurisdiction, whether he wanted to know or not. She made friends, or at least acquired a social circle, Mike Newton and Jessica Stanley and Angela Weber, attaching themselves to the new girl with enthusiasm that Charlie recognized as typical teenage behavior around novelty in a school where everyone had known everyone since kindergarten. He tried not to hover or ask too many questions, limiting himself to casual inquiries about her day that she answered with varying levels of detail, depending on her mood and her energy. Their dinner conversations brief, but somehow comfortable in ways that suggested they might actually manage to build relationship despite the years of distance and the fundamental awkwardness of their situation. The mention of the Cullens came within the first week. Bella's casual reference to the doctor's adopted kids who sat together in the cafeteria and kept to themselves, not triggering any particular concern in Charlie's mind beyond mild interest that she had noticed the family everyone in Forks found somewhat mysterious and endlessly fascinating. He knew Dr. Carlisle Cullen professionally through the hospital, where Charlie sometimes brought arrestees for medical clearance or victims for examination. His impression of the doctor entirely positive based on competence and demeanor, and the kind of old-fashioned courtesy that seemed rare in modern medical professionals. The family kept to themselves mostly, their wealth and their unusual household arrangement, and their striking physical beauty making them subjects of speculation and gossip that Charlie largely ignored as typical small-town nosiness about anyone who seemed different or refused to conform to expected social patterns. But Bella's interest in the Cullens seemed to intensify with concerning speed, her mentions of Edward Cullen becoming more frequent, and her preoccupation with this boy she barely knew becoming obvious to Charlie, despite his general obliviousness to teenage social dynamics and romantic entanglements. He tried to remain neutral and non-interfering, his memory of his own parents' attempts to control his dating life making him reluctant to repeat their mistakes, his understanding that forbidding a relationship would only make it more attractive to a teenage girl, making him bite his tongue and simply observe, while hoping this infatuation would fade naturally, as these things usually did. The van accident in the school parking lot happened on a Thursday in late January. Charlie, receiving the call on his radio while on patrol, that there had been an incident at the high school involving his daughter and Tyler Crowley's van, and possible injuries requiring ambulance transport to the hospital. His response was immediate and visceral. The professional calm he maintained during emergencies involving other people's children completely abandoning him when the victim was Bella. His drive to the hospital marked by speed that would have earned anyone else a reckless driving citation, and by prayers to a god he rarely acknowledged outside of moments of extreme desperation or fear. He arrived at the emergency room to find Bella sitting on an examination table, looking annoyed rather than injured. Her insistence that she was fine and that everyone was overreacting, doing little to calm his racing heart, or his need to verify with his own eyes that she was truly unharmed. Tyler Crowley was in the next bay over, looking devastated and guilty. His repeated apologies to Charlie and to Bella, making clear that the accident had been exactly that, rather than intentional harm or negligence. Though Charlie's cop brain noted the inconsistencies in the various witness statements about exactly how the accident had unfolded and how Bella had avoided being crushed between two vehicles that should have left her seriously injured or dead, Dr. Cullen examined Bella with professional competence that Charlie appreciated, even while some instinct he could not name made him uneasy about the doctor's presence and his interaction with Bella. Some quality to the way Edward Cullen hovered nearby, watching the examination with intensity that seemed disproportionate for a classmate who barely knew her. Charlie questioned Bella and the witnesses and Tyler with the thoroughness of someone conducting official investigation. His need to understand exactly what had happened warring with his relief that whatever had occurred had resulted in no serious injuries and no need for citations or arrests, or the complicated paperwork that motor vehicle accidents on school property always generated. But the incident marked a shift in Bella's relationship with Edward Cullen, the boy's name appearing in her conversation with increasing frequency after the accident. Her preoccupation with him becoming so obvious that even Charlie's limited emotional intelligence and his general obliviousness to teenage romance could not miss the signs that his daughter was falling hard for someone she had known for less than 2 weeks. He tried to ask casual questions about Edward that might give him information about this boy who had captured Bella's attention so completely, his inquiries receiving responses that were enthusiastic but somehow uninformative. Bella's descriptions of Edward's intelligence and his interesting conversation and his gentlemanly behavior, telling Charlie nothing useful about character or intentions, or whether this 17-year-old boy could be trusted with his daughter's heart and well-being. Billy Black's warnings about the Cullens began in February. His friend's comments initially vague and based on Quileute legends that Charlie dismissed as superstition and old prejudices that had no basis in reality or relevance to the modern world. Billy spoke of cold ones and ancient treaties and warnings passed down through generations about the Cullen family and what they really were. His insistence that Bella should stay away from them striking Charlie as paranoid and unreasonable, given that Dr. Cullen was a respected member of the community and his children had never caused any trouble or given anyone reason to fear or suspect them of anything beyond being unusual and private. Charlie defended the Cullens in these conversations with Billy, his irritation at his friend's persistence making him more supportive of Bella's relationship with Edward than he might otherwise have been. his refusal to indulge in what seemed like baseless gossip and prejudice, making him dismiss concerns that would later seem prescient and valid. The relationship intensified through February and March with speed that made Charlie uncomfortable, but that he did not know how to address without seeming controlling or unreasonable. Bella spending every possible moment with Edward, either at school or at the Cullen house, or driving around in Edward's expensive Volvo that appeared in Charlie's driveway with alarming regularity. She came home for dinner most nights in technical compliance with the rules Charlie had established about family meals, but her presence at the table was perfunctory and distracted, her attention clearly elsewhere, her eagerness to finish eating and return to whatever she and Edward did together, making conversation brief and unsatisfying. Charlie attempted the father-daughter talk about relationships and physical boundaries with awkwardness that made them both miserable. His inability to articulate his concerns about sex and safety and the emotional risks of intense teenage romance, reducing his planned speech to mumbled warnings about being careful and not letting things go too far, and remembering that she was only 17 and had her whole life ahead of her. Bella's mortification was evident in her red face and her refusal to make eye contact, her assurances that she understood, and that Charlie did not need to worry doing nothing to actually reassure him about what was happening between her and Edward, or whether appropriate boundaries were being maintained. He established a curfew of 10 o'clock on school nights and midnight on weekends. His attempt to maintain some parental authority and to ensure Bella got adequate sleep and maintain focus on her education, rather than spending every waking hour with her boyfriend. She complied with the curfew technically, arriving home at the designated times and going to her room. But Charlie began to suspect that Edward was visiting after curfew, based on sounds he heard from upstairs and based on the expensive car he occasionally glimpsed parked down the street in the early morning hours when he left for work. The knowledge that his daughter's boyfriend was likely in her bedroom at night should have prompted intervention and stricter rules and possibly confrontation with Edward or his parents. But Charlie found himself paralyzed by uncertainty about how to handle the situation without pushing Bella away or damaging their still fragile relationship. Edward himself remained unfailingly polite during his interactions with Charlie, his old-fashioned manners and his respectful demeanor making it difficult to dislike him, despite Charlie's growing unease about the relationship and its intensity. The boy called Bella's father Sir and shook hands with firm grip and made eye contact and said all the right things about treating Bella well and having her home on time. His performance of proper boyfriend behavior so perfect, it almost seemed rehearsed or artificial. Charlie wanted to trust this assessment of Edward as good kid who genuinely cared for Bella, but his cop instincts kept whispering that something was wrong, that the Cullen boy was hiding something significant, that the relationship was dangerous in ways Charlie could sense but not identify or articulate clearly enough to justify intervention. Billy's warnings escalated through spring, his friend becoming more explicit about his concerns and more insistent that Charlie needed to end Bella's relationship with Edward before something terrible happened. The conversations always ended in frustration and argument. Charlie's refusal to act on what seemed like baseless superstition, making Billy angry and making their friendship strain under the weight of disagreement about something that mattered deeply to them both. Billy spoke of bloodsuckers and monsters and ancient enemies, his language so extreme and his claims so impossible that Charlie dismissed them as senility or perhaps early dementia affecting his friend's rational thinking. His concern about Billy's mental state replacing his concern about whether the warnings themselves had any validity. The Port Angeles incident in March reinforced all of Charlie's worst fears about Bella's safety and Edward's role in her life. His daughter's shopping trip with friends somehow resulting in her being driven home by Edward from a location where he should not have been, and under circumstances that Bella refused to explain coherently. Charlie's questions about how Edward had known where to find her and why she had been separated from Jessica and Angela in the first place received answers that were clearly edited and incomplete. Bella's insistence that Edward had rescued her from some unspecified danger, making Charlie simultaneously grateful to the boy and suspicious about the entire situation. His attempt to investigate further and to determine whether criminal activity had occurred, the required police response was blocked by Bella's refusal to provide details or to identify any suspects, or even to confirm that anything illegal had actually happened beyond her being in the wrong part of town at the wrong time. The relationship consumed Bella entirely through spring, her grades remaining excellent, but her social connections beyond Edward withering to nothing. Jessica and Angela and Mike and the other friends she had made in January, barely seeing her anymore according to the reports Charlie heard through the gossip network. She was happy in ways Charlie had never seen her happy. Her smiles genuine and her laughter frequent when she was with Edward, or even when she was simply thinking about him. But the intensity of her attachment worried Charlie in ways he could not fully articulate even to himself. She seemed addicted rather than simply in love, her need for Edward's presence constant, and her distress when separated from him disproportionate to the actual duration or significance of their time apart. Charlie tried to talk to Renee about his concerns during one of their rare phone conversations, his hope that Bella's mother might have insight or advice about how to handle teenage daughter in intense relationship receiving responses that were unhelpful and frustrating. Renee thought it was wonderful that Bella had found someone who made her happy. Her opinion that Charlie should be grateful Bella was experiencing normal teenage romance rather than remaining isolated and friendless, making him feel like he was overreacting or being unreasonably protective. But Renee had not seen the relationship up close, had not watched Bella transform from independent person into half of a unit that could not function separately, had not felt the instinctive warning that something about Edward Cullen and his family was fundamentally wrong in ways that went beyond normal parental worry about daughters dating. The baseball game invitation came in April. Edward asking Charlie's permission to take Bella to meet his family properly and to spend the day with them doing some activity Edward described vaguely as family tradition. Charlie agreed despite his misgivings, because forbidding the visit would have required explanations he could not provide and would have damaged his relationship with Bella without actually protecting her from whatever danger his instincts were warning him about. She left with Edward looking excited and happy. Her casual mention that they would be gone most of the day and might be back late doing nothing to prepare Charlie for the terrified phone call he received hours later from Dr. Cullen, saying there had been an incident and that Bella was safe. but that she needed to leave town immediately for her own protection. The explanation made no sense. Dr. Cullen's vague references to dangerous individuals and threats to Bella's safety receiving questions that were answered with reassurances rather than actual information. Charlie's demand to know what had happened and who had threatened his daughter, and whether he needed to call for backup or issue alerts going unmet, as Carlyle simply repeated that Bella needed to leave Forks and that the family would ensure her safety. Edward appeared with Bella, who looked shaken but uninjured. Her insistence that she needed to go to Phoenix immediately to stay with Renee because her mother was hurt, creating panic in Charlie that was only partially relieved when he called Renee and found her confused but fine and completely unaware of any injury or reason for Bella's sudden arrival. The trip to Phoenix happened over Charlie's objections and against his better judgment. Bella leaving with Alice and Jasper Cullen, while Edward stayed behind with promises that he would explain everything once Bella was safe. But the explanation never came. Edward's vague references to a misunderstanding and a dangerous tracker who had fixated on Bella making no sense and providing no actionable information that Charlie could use to protect his daughter or to apprehend whoever had threatened her. The official story that eventually emerged involved some kind of accident in Phoenix and Bella falling downstairs and through a window, her injuries requiring hospitalization but not life-threatening. The inconsistencies in the various accounts making Charlie certain he was being lied to, but unable to determine the truth or to protect Bella from threats he could not identify or understand. Bella returned from Phoenix in May of 2005 with her arm in a cast and explanations that made no sense. Her story about falling downstairs and through a window at her mother's house, contradicted by details that did not align with the timeline or with Renee's own confused account of events she had not witnessed, and injuries she had not known about until receiving calls from the hospital. Charlie tried to extract the truth through careful questioning that utilized every interrogation technique his decades of police work had taught him. His patient approach and his seemingly casual inquiries designed to catch inconsistencies and to create opportunities for Bella to correct her story or to admit to whatever she was hiding. But Bella maintained her narrative with stubborn consistency that suggested either genuine belief in the lie she was telling or commitment to protecting someone or something that mattered more to her than honesty with her father. Her ability to look him in the eye while describing impossible sequences of events, making him wonder whether she had somehow convinced herself that the official story was true despite all evidence to the contrary. Edward's presence resumed immediately upon Bella's return, the boy appearing at the house within hours of her homecoming, with expression that mixed relief and guilt, and something darker that Charlie could not identify, but that made his cop instincts scream warnings he had no legitimate reason to act upon. The relationship continued through the remainder of spring and into summer, with the same consuming intensity that had characterized it before Phoenix. Bella spending every possible moment with Edward, while Charlie watched helplessly and worried constantly about dangers he could sense, but could not prevent or even properly identify. He tried to talk to her about the incident in Phoenix and about what had really happened, and about whether she was in some kind of trouble that required police protection or intervention. His questions receiving deflections and reassurances that did nothing to ease his concern or to provide actual information about the threats that had prompted her sudden flight from Forks and her mysterious injuries in Arizona. The summer passed with uneasy normalcy. Bella's happiness at being reunited with Edward obvious but somehow fragile. Her constant vigilance and her jumpiness at unexpected sounds suggesting that whatever had happened in Phoenix had left her traumatized in ways she would not discuss or acknowledge. Charlie observed changes in Edward as well, the boy's protectiveness toward Bella crossing from attentive to obsessive, his reluctance to let her out of his sight even for brief periods making Charlie wonder whether Edward knew something about threats to Bella's safety that he was not sharing with her father, who had both personal and professional interest in protecting her from harm. Billy's warnings had stopped after Phoenix, his friend's silence on the subject of the Cullens somehow more disturbing than his previous insistent complaints and dire predictions, the shift suggesting that something significant had changed in the situation, but that Billy was no longer willing to discuss it with Charlie, or to continue trying to convince him of dangers he refused to acknowledge. The distance that grew between Charlie and Billy through that summer felt like losing another anchor, their fishing trips becoming less frequent and their conversations more stilted as the unspoken disagreement about Bella and Edward created barrier that neither of them knew how to bridge or dissolve, without one of them admitting they had been wrong about fundamental issues that defined their respective world views and their understanding of what was possible or real in the world they inhabited. September brought Bella's 18th birthday and a party at the Cullen house that she attended, despite her obvious reluctance and her expressed preference for not celebrating at all. Edward's family apparently insisting on marking the occasion in ways that made Bella uncomfortable, but that she couldn't refuse without seeming ungrateful or rude. Charlie dropped her off at the Cullens' impressive house with misgivings he could not articulate, his concern about leaving her alone with that family based on nothing concrete, but on the persistent low-level unease that had characterized all his interactions with the Cullens and his observations of their relationship with his daughter. She returned home that evening earlier than he had expected, her arm bandaged and her demeanor subdued, her explanations about a paper cut and some broken glass, and her own clumsiness seeming plausible enough given her well-established tendency toward minor injuries and accidents that had plagued her entire life. Charlie accepted the explanation because he had no reason not to. His concern about the wound minimal compared to his relief that she was home safely and that whatever celebration the Cullens had planned had not resulted in more serious harm or extended into the late hours that would have violated the curfew he still maintained despite Bella's legal adulthood. He offered to take her to the hospital to have the cut examined properly, his professional familiarity with the importance of proper wound care making him cautious about injuries that might require stitches or antibiotics. But Bella insisted that Dr. Cullen had already treated it and that it was fine, and that she just wanted to go to bed and forget about the entire embarrassing evening. But something changed after that birthday party. The shift in Bella and Edward's relationship so dramatic and so devastating that Charlie could not miss the signs even with his limited emotional perceptiveness and his general inability to read subtle social cues. Edward stopped coming to the house within days of the party, his car no longer appearing in the driveway at all hours, his calls to Bella going unanswered, or resulting in brief conversations that left her looking stricken and confused. The boy's sudden withdrawal, recreating the abandonment pattern that had defined Bella's relationship with Charlie himself, and that seemed designed to inflict maximum damage on someone whose abandonment trauma was already profound and poorly healed from the divorce and the years of minimal contact with her father. Charlie tried to ask what had happened and whether they had broken up, and whether Bella wanted to talk about her feelings or needed support or comfort that he had no idea how to provide, but was desperate to offer anyway. His awkward attempts at emotional availability received silence or monosyllabic responses that made clear she would not or could not discuss what was destroying her so visibly and so completely. Her retreat into herself reminiscent of the weeks after the divorce, when she had been too young to understand why her family was fragmenting, but old enough to feel the loss and the pain of separation from her father. The Cullens left Forks in late September, Dr. Cullen's resignation from the hospital, and the family's sudden departure becoming the primary topic of small-town gossip, within hours of their moving trucks pulling away from the big white house outside town that had always seemed too grand and too isolated for a family that claimed to want integration into the community. Charlie heard the news at work before he could hear it from Bella. The dispatcher mentioning the Cullens' departure as interesting local news during a slow shift. His immediate concern about how his daughter would handle Edward's permanent departure, making him leave his patrol early and drive home to check on her well-being and to offer whatever support she would accept from him. He found her in her room, sitting on the bed staring at nothing, her expression blank and her body present, but her consciousness somewhere else entirely. Her eyes open but not seeing, and her breathing shallow and irregular in ways that made Charlie wonder whether she was in some kind of shock or dissociative state that required immediate medical intervention. His questions and his attempts to comfort her received no response or acknowledgement that she even heard him speaking, his hand on her shoulder producing no reaction, his voice calling her name failing to penetrate whatever internal space she had retreated to in order to survive the loss of the person who had become central to her existence and her identity. The zombie months began that evening and continued through fall and into winter, with no signs of improvement or recovery. Bella's complete emotional collapse transforming her from functional if unhappy teenager into hollow shell that moved through required activities without thought or engagement or any sign of the person she had been before Edward Cullen entered and then destroyed her life. She attended school mechanically and maintained her grades through what must have been pure force of will or simple intellectual capability that continued functioning even when everything else had shut down. Her ability to complete assignments and pass tests existing alongside complete inability to engage socially or emotionally with her environment or the people trying to reach her. Her teachers expressed concern to Charlie during parent-teacher conferences in October. Their carefully worded questions about whether something had happened at home or whether Bella was dealing with depression or trauma that required professional intervention, making clear that her condition was obvious to everyone who encountered her. Charlie tried to explain about the breakup and the Cullens leaving, without revealing how completely the relationship had consumed Bella, or how devastating the loss had been. His attempts to minimize the situation probably fooling no one, but maintaining the illusion that he had things under control and that his daughter would recover with time and patience and the normal healing processes that followed teenage heartbreak. The night terrors started within days of Edward's departure. Bella's screams waking Charlie from sleep multiple times each night and sending him running to her room, where he would find her sitting up in bed sobbing and shaking and calling for Edward in voice that broke his heart with its desperation and its grief. She could not or would not describe the nightmares that were tormenting her, her consciousness upon waking seeming confused about whether the dreams were worse than the reality of Edward's absence, her tears continuing long after the screaming stopped, and making clear that waking provided no relief from whatever suffering she was experiencing in sleep. Charlie started sleeping on the floor outside her bedroom door after the first week of nightly terrors, his aging back protesting the hard surface and his sleep fragmentary and unsatisfying, but his need to be close enough to hear her and to respond immediately to her distress, overriding all concerns about his own comfort or rest or the physical toll the arrangement was taking on his body. He brought his pillow and a blanket and positioned himself across her threshold like a guardian, or perhaps like someone keeping vigil over a dying patient, his presence providing no apparent comfort to Bella, but giving him the illusion that he was doing something useful rather than simply witnessing her suffering without ability to alleviate or prevent it. His co-workers noticed his exhaustion and his distraction within days, the dark circles under his eyes and his difficulty concentrating on routine tasks, making obvious that something was wrong at home, even though Charlie tried to maintain his usual professional demeanor. Their careful questions about whether everything was okay, receiving vague reassurances that convinced no one, but that maintained the privacy Charlie felt Bella deserved, even in her suffering. His refusal to discuss his daughter's breakdown with anyone except Billy, and occasionally Renee protecting Bella's dignity, even as it isolated Charlie further in his worry and his helplessness. He called Renee in October to discuss whether Bella should return to Phoenix for professional help or change of environment that might break the pattern of depression and withdrawal that was consuming her. His fear that she was in genuine psychiatric crisis, making him willing to lose her again, if it meant she would recover and return to some semblance of normal functioning. Renee was appropriately alarmed by Charlie's description of Bella's condition, her own suggestions about therapy and antidepressants, and possibly psychiatric hospitalization, making clear that she understood the seriousness of the situation even from distance. Her offer to fly to Forks to see Bella herself reflecting maternal concern that overcame her usual avoidance of the rainy town she had fled nearly 2 decades earlier. But Bella begged him not to send her away when he broached the subject during one of the rare moments when she seemed present enough to actually hear and process what he was saying. Her desperate pleas and her promises to try harder and to be better, making him relent despite his certainty that she needed more help than he could provide, and more intervention than Forks could offer, given the limited mental health resources available in small rural communities, where therapy meant driving to Port Angeles once a week, and where psychiatric care required referrals to Seattle specialists who had months-long waiting lists. The improvement began gradually in January of 2006, when Bella started spending time at La Push with Jacob Black. the friendship rekindling after years of minimal contact, providing the first sign of life or interest Charlie had seen in his daughter since September. He encouraged the relationship with enthusiasm that probably seemed excessive, but that reflected his desperate gratitude that something or someone had managed to reach Bella and to pull her back from whatever edge she had been approaching throughout the dark months of fall and early winter. Jacob was safe and normal and warm in ways that Edward had never been. His interest in Bella obvious, and his good nature and his easy affection and his complete lack of supernatural mystery or danger exactly what she needed after months of isolation and grief over losing someone who had been wrong for her in every way that mattered. Charlie's approval of the friendship was absolute, and his hope that it might develop into something more, making him shameless in his encouragement of Bella's visits to the reservation. His suggestions that she should invite Jacob to dinner or should spend more time at La Push transparent in their intention, but seemingly effective in giving Bella permission to pursue relationship that might actually be healthy and age appropriate and based on genuine compatibility rather than obsessive codependence. She came home from those visits to Jacob looking more alive than she had looked in months, her smiles genuine rather than forced, her conversation actually responsive rather than perfunctory, her sleep improving as the nightmares became less frequent and less intense. Billy shared Charlie's approval and his relief during their resumed fishing trips, the two fathers bonding over their children's friendship in ways that began to repair the damage their disagreement about the Cullens had created in their own relationship. They discussed Jacob and Bella with the careful optimism of parents who have watched their children suffer and who desperately wanted to believe that happiness might be possible. Their shared hope that the friendship would blossom into romance, creating alliance between them that felt like reclaiming something valuable that had been nearly lost to supernatural fears and mundane disagreements. But the improvement proved temporary. Jacob's sudden withdrawal from Bella in late February, recreating the abandonment pattern with horrible precision and sending her spiraling back into the zombie state with terrifying speed that made clear her recovery had been fragile and incomplete. Charlie watched helplessly as Bella tried repeatedly to contact Jacob, only to be turned away or ignored, her confusion and hurt transforming rapidly into the blank depression that had characterized the months after Edward's departure. The loss of her second anchor within 6 months, creating damage that Charlie feared might be permanent or might push her past the point where recovery was possible without serious professional intervention. He tried to find out what had happened and why Jacob had suddenly stopped taking Bella's calls or allowing her to visit. His own calls to Billy receiving evasive responses that suggested something serious had occurred, but that Billy either could not or would not explain in ways that would make sense to Charlie, or that would provide actionable information about how to fix whatever had broken between the two teenagers. Billy's mentions of Jacob being sick and needing space and going through changes that made him unavailable for friendship sounded like excuses designed to deflect rather than genuine explanations. The lack of specific medical information or timeline for recovery, making Charlie suspicious that the illness was either fabricated or was cover story for something else entirely. The mention of Sam Yulee and his group made Charlie's cop instincts activate with concerns about gang activity or drugs. or some kind of criminal enterprise recruiting reservation teenagers. His observation that several young men from La Push had recently undergone similar transformations and had joined Sam's group, creating pattern that seemed concerning from law enforcement perspective. But his jurisdiction did not extend to tribal land, and his friendship with Billy prevented him from pursuing official investigation that would have damaged their relationship beyond repair, and that would have violated the sovereignty and the privacy that the Quileute nation maintained over their internal affairs and their young people. Bella's behavior became increasingly reckless through March. Her seeming need to court danger or to feel something through physical risk, making Charlie terrified that she would seriously injure herself or worse in her pursuit of whatever satisfaction or relief the adrenaline provided. The discovery that she owned a motorcycle that she had been hiding in Jacob's garage and riding without proper safety equipment or training prompted confrontation with Charlie that accomplished nothing, except making clear that normal parental discipline and consequences had no effect on someone who seemed to be actively seeking danger, or perhaps even seeking death as escape from emotional pain she could not process or survive. He grounded her and took her truck keys and delivered lectures about safety and responsibility that she listened to with blank expression, before simply finding other ways to do whatever reckless activity currently appealed to her. His powerlessness to protect her from herself, making him understand how Renee must have felt watching Bella take care of everything while being unable to actually parent effectively or to provide the structure and boundaries that children needed, regardless of how mature or capable they seemed. The cliff diving incident happened on a day in late March when Charlie was responding to a call about Harry Clearwater's heart attack, the convergence of his friend's death, and his daughter's near drowning, creating trauma that would mark Charlie permanently, and that would make that day stand out in his memory as one of the worst of his entire life. He was at the hospital with Sue Clearwater and her children when he received the call that Bella had been pulled from the ocean at La Push by Jacob Black, that she had apparently jumped from the high cliffs alone during a storm and had nearly drowned in the violent surf before Jacob somehow managed to reach her and bring her to shore. Charlie arrived home from the hospital where Harry had been pronounced dead to find Alice Cullen sitting in his living room uninvited. Her presence in his house without permission or explanation triggering rage that had been building for months about the Cullen family and their destruction of his daughter's well-being, and their casual disregard for the damage they had caused through their relationship with Bella and their sudden abandonment, when whatever game they had been playing with her heart and her life apparently ceased to amuse them. He demanded to know what she was doing there and how she had gotten into his house, his police authority and his paternal fury combining to make his voice harsh and his body language threatening in ways he rarely allowed himself to display, even with actual criminals. Alice tried to explain something about visions and misunderstandings and thinking Bella was dead based on seeing her jump from the cliff, her words making no sense within any rational framework and providing no acceptable justification for her presence or for the pain her family had inflicted on Bella through their involvement and subsequent abandonment. Charlie's attempts to process what Alice was saying while simultaneously dealing with Harry's death and Bella's near drowning and the general chaos of the afternoon made him feel like he was losing his grip on reality or on his ability to manage the multiple crises that seemed to be converging on his life with coordinated malevolence. The phone call happened while Charlie was still trying to process Alice Cullen's bizarre presence in his living room, and her even more bizarre explanations about visions and cliff diving and misunderstandings. The ringing of the landline cutting through the tension and the confusion with mundane normalcy that felt surreal given the circumstances. Alice's expression transformed to something like horror when Charlie answered, his side of the conversation revealing that the caller was asking for Dr. Cullen and seemed to believe someone had died. Charlie's confused responses about no one being dead here, and Bella being fine, making Alice lunge for the phone with desperation. That would have been comical if the situation had not been so completely inexplicable and disturbing. He overheard fragments of Alice's rapid conversation in what sounded like Italian, her panic evident despite the language barrier preventing Charlie from understanding the specific content. Her pleas and her obvious distress making clear that something catastrophic had happened or was about to happen that involved the Cullens and somehow also involved Bella. When Alice ended the call, her face was ashen, her explanation tumbling out in fragments that Charlie struggled to piece together into coherent narrative about Edward believing Bella was dead based on Alice's vision and Charlie's answers to questions about funerals, about Edward's plan to force some group in Italy called the Volturi to kill him by exposing himself as vampire in crowded plaza during a festival. The casual mention of vampires should have been the moment when Charlie dismissed everything Alice was saying as delusion or prank or evidence of serious mental illness requiring immediate intervention. But something about her genuine terror and her complete lack of guile or performance made the impossible claim feel somehow less impossible than it should have. His cop instincts that had been screaming warnings about the Cullens for months, suddenly finding framework that made all the strangeness and all the inconsistencies and all the supernatural impossibilities click into pattern. That was absurd, but that explained everything he had observed and everything he had sensed but could not name. Bella's insistence on going with Alice to stop Edward from killing himself in Italy was so absurd that Charlie initially refused to even consider allowing it. His parental authority and his common sense and his professional understanding of how completely insane the entire situation sounded combining to make his rejection immediate and absolute. But Bella's desperation and her threats to leave without permission, and her obvious determination to go regardless of what he said, eventually wore down his resistance and his better judgment, her willingness to destroy their relationship and to defy him completely, making clear that preventing her departure would require physically restraining her, and that such action would damage their bond beyond any hope of repair. He let her go with Alice on the promise that she would call when she arrived safely, and that she would return within a few days at most. His certainty that he was making a terrible mistake outweighed by his understanding that physically preventing her from leaving would only create a permanent rift between them, without actually keeping her safe from whatever danger she believed Edward was facing. He watched them drive away in Alice's Porsche, with dread settling in his stomach like lead weight. His inability to protect Bella from her own choices and from the supernatural world that had claimed her, making him feel more helpless than he had felt since the divorce, when Renee had driven away with infant Bella and left him standing alone in his driveway. The days Bella was gone were torture, her brief phone calls from Italy providing minimal reassurance and maximum confusion, her vague explanations about Edward being fine and everything being resolved, doing nothing to address Charlie's questions about what had actually happened or why the trip had been necessary or what dangers she had faced in foreign country without proper supervision or protection. She returned with Edward, the reunion happening in Charlie's driveway, with the boy appearing as if the months of absence and the devastation he had caused could be erased or forgiven simply by showing up and acting like nothing had changed. Charlie tried to forbid the relationship, his parental authority invoked too late and too weakly to have any actual effect on Bella's choices or Edward's presence in her life. Her legal adulthood and her obvious determination to be with Edward regardless of consequences, making his objections pointless and his attempts at protection futile. He established new rules about Edward not being allowed in the house, his prohibition lasting exactly 1 day before Bella's misery, and her arguments about unfairness and about her age and her right to make her own decisions wore him down into compromise that allowed Edward to visit during reasonable hours with the door to Bella's room remaining open and with curfews that Charlie knew were being violated but could not enforce without constant surveillance that would make living together impossible. The months after Italy passed in uneasy truce, Charlie, watching helplessly as Bella and Edward's relationship resumed with even greater intensity than before, her complete devotion to the boy who had abandoned her, making no sense to Charlie, but seeming unshakable, despite his gentle attempts to point out that Edward had proven himself unreliable and that Bella deserved someone who would not leave when things became difficult. His suggestions that she consider dating Jacob or other boys her own age received responses ranging from patient explanations that she loved Edward, and only Edward, to frustrated insistence that Charlie did not understand and needed to stop interfering in her life and her choices. The tension with Jacob and the reservation became more pronounced through spring, Billy's warnings resuming with new urgency and new explicitness about the danger the Cullens represented and about ancient treaties and boundaries that were being violated by Edward's presence in Bella's life. Charlie found himself mediating between Billy's insistence that Bella stay away from Edward and the Cullens, and Bella's equally strong insistence that she would see whomever she wanted, regardless of what anyone thought or said about it. His position in the middle creating stress that affected his friendships and his relationship with his daughter and his ability to maintain any illusion of control over the situation. The camping trip incident happened in June. Bella returning from overnight expedition with Edward and Jacob looking exhausted and somehow different. Her explanations about camping in the mountains vague and unsatisfying. Her visible injuries including bruises and scratches that she attributed to clumsiness and difficult terrain, seeming more extensive than a simple camping trip should produce. Charlie's questions about appropriate supervision and about whether anything dangerous had happened, receiving reassurances that did nothing to ease his concern or to explain why all three of them looked like they had been through something significantly more traumatic than sleeping in a tent and hiking in the woods. The summer passed with Charlie increasingly aware that something significant was happening or had happened that Bella was not sharing with him. Her relationship with Edward somehow both more stable and more intense. Her time split between the Cullens and Jacob with careful balance that suggested complicated dynamics Charlie did not understand and probably did not want to understand. He heard rumors through the Forks gossip network about trouble in Seattle, about murders and disappearances that had police baffled and citizens frightened. His professional interest in the cases minimal, given that they were outside his jurisdiction and handled by Seattle PD and state investigators who had more resources and more expertise than small-town police chief could offer. The marriage announcement came in late July during dinner. Bella's casual mention that she and Edward were engaged delivered with the kind of false nonchalance that suggested she expected negative reaction and had prepared arguments to counter his objections. Charlie's shock was immediate and total, his fork clattering against his plate as he processed what she had just said, his mind struggling to accept that his 18-year-old daughter, who had barely graduated high school and who had known Edward for less than 2 years, was planning to get married to the boy, who had already abandoned her once and nearly destroyed her completely. His objections poured out in rush of concerns about her age and about rushing into commitments she might regret, and about not knowing Edward well enough, and about needing to finish college and establish herself before making such permanent decisions. Bella listened with patient expression that suggested she had anticipated every argument and had prepared responses. Her calm explanation that she loved Edward and wanted to marry him, and that waiting served no purpose, making Charlie feel like he was talking to a stranger rather than to his daughter, who should have better sense than to throw her life away on teenage romance that statistics said would end in divorce. He tried the practical arguments next, pointing out financial realities and the difficulties of marriage at such young age and the importance of education and career development before settling down. His desperation to find something that would make her reconsider evident in the increasingly weak objections he raised. But Bella had answers for everything. Edward's family wealth eliminating financial concerns, her plans to attend college in Alaska or somewhere near wherever the Cullens decided to settle addressing education issues, her absolute certainty that Edward was her future, and her forever making every argument Charlie raised seem irrelevant and beside the point. The conversation with Edward happened the next day at Charlie's insistence, the young man appearing at the police station for meeting that Charlie framed as official, even though his questions had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with paternal concern and desire to protect daughter from mistake that would define the rest of her life. Edward sat across from Charlie's desk with his usual perfect posture and his careful courtesy. His answers to questions about his intentions and his ability to support Bella, and his understanding of the seriousness of marriage, delivered with sincerity that seemed genuine, but that also seemed somehow rehearsed, or at least carefully considered, before being spoken aloud. Charlie asked about the disappearance and the months when Edward had been gone, and what guarantee Bella had that he would not leave again when things became difficult, or when his interest waned, his bluntness about his concerns surprising Edward into brief silence before the young man explained that leaving had been a mistake he would never repeat, that the time apart had taught him that he could not exist without Bella, and that marriage was his way of proving his commitment was permanent and absolute. The explanation should have been reassuring, but instead made Charlie more uneasy. The intensity of Edward's devotion seeming unhealthy and obsessive rather than romantic. His suggestion that he literally could not live without Bella, raising concerns about codependency and about what would happen if the relationship ever did end despite Edward's promises. But Charlie had no legal grounds to prevent the marriage and no moral authority to forbid adult daughter from making her own choices, no matter how much he disagreed with those choices. His acceptance of the engagement reluctant and conditional on Bella finishing high school and on the wedding being delayed until after graduation at minimum. She agreed to these terms with ease that suggested she had been prepared to fight harder and was relieved to win his grudging approval with such minimal compromise. Her hug and her thanks making him feel like he had somehow lost negotiation he had not realized he was having. The wedding preparations began immediately, with Alice Cullen taking charge of every detail with enthusiasm that overwhelmed Bella's protests and Charlie's budget concerns. The small, simple ceremony Charlie had envisioned transforming into elaborate production that would apparently involve hundreds of guests and thousands of dollars in flowers and catering and rental equipment. Alice's assurances that the Cullen family would cover all expenses did nothing to make Charlie comfortable with the extravagance. His working-class sensibilities rebelling against the waste and the display, even as he recognized that objecting would only create conflict without changing anything about how the wedding would proceed. He called Renee to inform her of the engagement, his hope that Bella's mother would share his concerns and would perhaps talk Bella out of marrying so young, receiving disappointment when Renee expressed excitement and happiness for Bella, rather than alarm or concern about the rushed timeline. Renee's reminder that she herself had married young, and that while her marriage to Charlie had not worked out, that did not mean Bella's marriage would fail, felt like criticism of their past and validation of Bella's current choices. Her suggestion that Charlie should be supportive rather than negative, making him feel guilty for his very legitimate concerns about his daughter's future. The months leading up to the wedding passed in blur of preparations and plans that happened around Charlie, rather than involving him. His role reduced to approving expenses and showing up when required for fittings or meetings or decisions about details he did not care about and did not understand. He watched Bella transform from his daughter into someone else's future wife, her focus shifting entirely to Edward and to the Cullens and to the life she would have after the wedding, her conversations with Charlie becoming increasingly rare and increasingly superficial as they ran out of common ground and common interests that did not involve the wedding or Edward or the future that was taking her away from him. Jacob's reaction to the engagement was predictably negative, the young man appearing at Charlie's house in July to express his objections and his concerns in language that was more explicit and more alarming than anything Billy had said previously. Jacob spoke openly about vampires and werewolves and the danger Bella was in by marrying into the Cullen family. His casual mention of supernatural creatures that should not exist, delivered with such matter-of-fact certainty that Charlie found himself almost believing despite the complete impossibility of what Jacob was describing. The conversation ended with Charlie asking Jacob to leave and to stop spreading ridiculous stories, but the seeds of doubt had been planted, and the confirmation of suspicions Charlie had been harboring for years made it increasingly difficult to maintain the comfortable fiction that everything was normal and explainable within rational framework. August 13th arrived with weather that Alice had somehow predicted would be perfect. the clouds breaking just enough to allow filtered sunlight without the direct brightness that would have made outdoor ceremony uncomfortable in the August heat. Charlie put on the tuxedo that Alice had selected and that fit him better than he expected, his discomfort with formal wear making him tug at the bow tie and the cuffs while trying to mentally prepare himself for walking his daughter down the aisle and giving her away to the Cullens and to Edward and to the life that would take her somewhere Charlie could not follow. Renee arrived with Phil 2 days before the wedding. Her excitement and her happiness at seeing Bella getting married creating atmosphere of celebration that Charlie could not fully participate in despite his efforts to appear supportive and pleased. He watched Renee and Bella together and saw the closeness and the easy affection that had never existed between himself and his daughter. His jealousy and his regret about the years lost and the relationship never built, making him withdraw into his usual silence rather than attempting to insert himself into moments that clearly belonged to mother and daughter, rather than to the father who had been mostly absent from Bella's life. The wedding day itself arrived too quickly. Charlie's hope that something would happen to delay or prevent the ceremony going unfulfilled, as the hours ticked down toward the moment when he would have to let Bella go permanently and irrevocably. He stood in Alice's bathroom where Bella was being prepared and tried to have the father-daughter conversation about marriage and life and his hopes for her happiness. His prepared speech dissolving into awkward fragments about wanting her to be happy and wanting her to know she could always come home if things did not work out, and wanting her to be sure this was what she really wanted. Bella's reassurances that she was sure and that she loved Edward and that everything would be fine did nothing to ease Charlie's concern or to make him feel better about losing his daughter to marriage that seemed premature and potentially dangerous in ways he could not articulate without sounding insane or paranoid. He looked at her in her wedding dress and saw simultaneously the baby he had held for too brief a time 18 years earlier, and the stranger she had become through years of separation and distance that could never be recovered or rebuilt. His grief at what had been lost mixing with his fear about what was coming in ways that made speaking impossible and made standing there pretending to be happy, father of the bride, feel like performance he was failing to execute convincingly. The ceremony itself was beautiful in ways that Charlie could acknowledge even through his sadness and his worry. The Cullens' backyard transformed into venue worthy of magazine feature. The flowers and the decorations and the careful arrangement of chairs and altar, creating atmosphere of romance and celebration that hundreds of guests clearly appreciated based on their reactions and their compliments. He walked Bella down the aisle with her hand gripping his arm tightly enough to leave marks, his awareness that every step was taking her further away from him and closer to Edward, making each movement feel weighted and significant and final in ways that made his chest tight and his breathing difficult. The moment of giving her away was agony, Charlie's hand releasing Bella's and placing it in Edward's palm, representing transfer of responsibility and authority that felt like losing her all over again, his tears embarrassing him, but apparently moving several guests who commented later about how touching it was to see the stoic police chief showing emotion at his daughter's wedding. He sat through the ceremony in the front row beside Renee, who cried happily while Charlie cried for entirely different reasons. His grief at losing Bella warring with his resignation, that this was what she wanted, and that preventing it would only damage their relationship without actually keeping her safe or changing her determination to spend her life with Edward. The reception that followed was celebration that Charlie participated in mechanically, his conversations with guests perfunctory and his smile forced, his attention fixed on Bella and Edward and on the obvious happiness radiating from both of them that should have made him happy, but instead made him feel more alone and more aware that he had lost his daughter to something he could not compete with or understand. He danced with Bella when tradition demanded, his arms around his daughter while music played and guests watched, his throat too tight for the words he wanted to say about loving her and wanting her to be safe and wishing things could be different. Jacob appeared late in the reception after Charlie had assumed he would not come at all. The young man's presence in formal clothes that looked uncomfortable on his large frame, drawing attention and creating visible tension among the Cullen family members who watched him with expressions ranging from wary to hostile. Charlie watched Jacob and Bella dance together with her in her wedding dress, and him trying to smile despite obvious pain, their friendship solid enough to survive her marriage to someone Jacob viewed as wrong for her and dangerous to her. The conversation Charlie could not hear but could read in their body language, clearly involving farewells and good wishes and acknowledgement that this wedding marked ending of whatever possibilities might have existed between them. The confrontation between Jacob and Edward happened near the end of the reception, when Jacob apparently learned something about the honeymoon plans that triggered rage of violence enough to require Sam Yulee and several other Quileute men to physically restrain him and remove him from the property before he could cause scene that would destroy the celebration and expose whatever supernatural tensions existed beneath the surface normalcy. Charlie intervened in his official capacity as police chief, his authority and his relationship with Billy, allowing him to defuse the situation before it escalated into violence that would have required arrests and explanations and police reports that would have been impossible to write within any rational framework. The departure for the honeymoon happened with rice and well wishes and celebration that felt bittersweet to Charlie as he watched Bella and Edward drive away in a car decorated with streamers and cans, his daughter leaving not just for honeymoon, but for life that would take her away from Forks and away from him permanently. She hugged him goodbye with promises to call and to visit and to stay in touch, that they both knew would be difficult to keep once she was living wherever the Cullens decided to settle, and starting whatever life she and Edward would build together as married couple. Charlie stood in the driveway long after the car disappeared, the guests dispersing and the caterers cleaning, and Alice directing the removal of decorations and rental equipment, while he remained frozen in the spot where he had last held his daughter. Renee approached with Phil and suggested they all go inside and have a drink and decompress after the emotional day. But Charlie declined with excuse about needing to check on something at work, his real need being to escape and to process alone the loss and the grief and the fear about Bella's future that he could not express to anyone without seeming like he was raining on her happiness. He drove to the station and sat in his office in the dark, the building empty on Saturday evening, his mind replaying moments from Bella's childhood and from the wedding, and trying to reconcile the baby he had loved and lost with a woman who had just married into family of vampires, and who seemed determined to join them in whatever supernatural existence they lived. His acceptance of the impossible had come gradually, and then all at once. The accumulation of evidence and the confirmation from Jacob and his own observations finally overwhelming his rational resistance and forcing him to acknowledge that the world contained things that should not exist, but that clearly did. The phone call from Bella came 2 weeks later from somewhere she described as an island off the coast of Brazil. Her voice happy and her reassurances that everything was wonderful and that married life was everything she had hoped, doing nothing to ease Charlie's worry about her safety or her future. And so, Charlie Swan's story became one of loving through silence and distance, of sacrificing again and again for the daughter he could never quite reach or hold or keep safe from the darkness she chose willingly over every safer alternative he tried to offer. He let Renee take Bella away when she was 6 months old because keeping her seemed selfish. He let the summer visits end when Bella was 14 because forcing her seemed cruel. He let her live with him, knowing she came out of duty to Renee rather than desire to know him. He let her love Edward despite every instinct screaming danger because forbidding her would only push her further away. He walked her down the aisle and gave her to the vampires because that was what she wanted. His love manifesting through letting go rather than holding on, through silent support rather than loud objection, through presence even when presence meant witnessing loss. Charlie Swan loved his daughter the only way he knew how, through actions rather than words, through steadiness rather than demonstration, through being there always, even when they meant standing alone in empty houses, waiting for phone calls that came less and less frequently. So, rest now, gentle dreamers, with Charlie's quiet strength and his endless patient devotion, the father who stayed when everyone left, who loved without requiring love returned, whose heroism lived in simple, steady presence through rain and loss, and years of beautiful, terrible silence.